The sea before her was not sea but a garden of smoke. It breathed in slow gray flowers that opened and collapsed, and when the wind laid them aside she saw the broken teeth of towers, the ribbed arch of a bridge that began nowhere and went nowhere, the flensed rock of a city gnawed to white by salt and heat. The smoking sea exhaled again, and she tasted iron at the back of her throat, as if she had bitten her own lip without noticing. The ship shuddered, a minute shiver that moved up through wood and nail and came to rest at the base of her skull. She stood at the prow and felt its tremor thrum against her shins. The figurehead had once been a gilded swan. Its neck stayed bent in the old proud curve, but half the head was cored away by salt, blank as the face of a doll left in sun. The men called the ship Wave Cutter, though nothing could cut this water. The oars took it on the surface, the men sweating silently, eyes fixed on the middle distance, unwilling to look at the ruin that drifted nearer with every stroke. At their belts they carried lucky charms, shells rubbed smooth by thumb and superstition, bits of blue glass, crudely knotted cords said to ward off ghosts. Above them, her 3 dragons circled in uneasy loops. The nearest came lower, shadowing the prow with stretched wings. Drogon's eye rolled, dark as a polished fruit stone, a depth that caught sunlight like a fish catches a hook. His breath was a slow vote of distrust. She reached up, palm open, and the wind took the edge of her sleeve and tugged it like a child. "Not yet," Daenerys said, though she did not know who she was denying, dragon or herself. Missandei lifted a hand to shade her eyes, squinting toward the collapsed skyline. Her hair was braided back, her face 2 shades darker from the weeks at sea. Fine lines set at the corners of her mouth where she had learned to think and hold her counsel simultaneously. She wore a gray scarf around her neck against the ash that came and went like unseasonable snow. "Your Grace," Missandei murmured, soft so the men would not hear the worry riding the title. "According to the charts, this is the outermost shoal that ever was marked. After this, the depths are guesswork." "After this," Daenerys replied, "there is only what we came for." Missandei did not answer. The oars knocked softly into their locks and out again. The deck creaked. Her skin smelled faintly of salt and wood tar. Every sound had its own small place and filled it. The entire day had arranged itself around them with obedience, and that made her uneasy, for she had learned that obedience can be a false friend. She thought of Meereen's summer streets, of the cries of the freed, and of how quickly sweetness in the mouth could turn to gall in the gut. She thought of the child's burnt bones held out like an accusation. She had done so many things, believing them to be one kind of good, only to learn they were another. Now she had chosen a thing that was neither simply good nor simply wicked but necessary, and she moved toward it because she could not imagine any other movement. The ruins unrolled nearer until they were not ruined to the eye but particular shapes. A balcony where salt had grown into calcified lace, a tower with a twist in it as if gripped and wrung by a hand. The air above the water was warm, as if the sea had a fever. From below came a knocking, not of oars, but deeper, a thunder from within stone, as if the world were a great cask being tapped for its last swallow. Drogon croaked and threw his head as if something tugged at his mouth. Rhaegal answered from a pale height of sky, his voice higher and wilder. Viserion hugged a coil of vapor and sculled with his wings without moving anywhere. The wind fell and the ash fell with it and layered itself along the line of her cheekbone, delicate as a new-bloomed powder on a plum. She brushed it away. The ash smeared, left a gray finger on her skin. In the archives at Karth, the men had called Valyria the city of the unextinguished fire, and she had thought that a poet's lie, and then she had found the map with the old channels drawn in a thin, unhesitating hand, and the notes in the margin that referenced a lattice. The lattice had not been made of metal. It had been woven of wanting. Missandei saw where she was looking and touched the roll of parchment she kept tucked beneath her belt. "We will find it," she said, "if it is there to be found." The men murmured, a small low storm of sound, as the oars dragged in. The ship hissed past a pillared walkway that ended abruptly. Its last column split down the length, and in the fissure a lizard lay like a black punctuation mark, breathing quickly. Her eyes ran along the broken avenue of it. The ash had drifted against the pillars in small dunes that wore scalloped ridges as if wind had combed them with a fine-toothed comb. She thought of combs and then of hair. She thought of her brother's white hair under dust. She was not a girl who would jump at shadows. She had decided that when shadows began to run from her, she would follow. On shore, the ground crackled underfoot. It was not the crack of ice that yields in a soft, wet sigh, but the brittle crack of something long dried. When her boot came down, black flakes shivered sideways. The men stayed by the boats. They watched the angles of the sky as if expecting it to tilt. She and Missandei walked forward, and Drogon came down to a higher ruin and placed himself there like a carved guardian, physician, executioner. The street, or what had once been a street, was bordered by half-buildings in which rooms opened like mouths. Threads of old metal were visible in the rubble, peeled from mullions and beams, and when the wind scraped the rubble's face, the thin threads hummed in a faint, unmusical chord. The song of what money once bought, she thought, then shook her head. It was not a song, only noise. Her thoughts wanted to make too much of things here. The stones encouraged it. Their stillness was not passive. It watched. They passed a basin that had caught some of the ash and some of the rain of last night and made a paste that was the color of doves. A long line of black beetles clambered up the inner slope by inches, working as one. When she leaned over to see more closely, she saw in the ash a blue-eyed thing, not fish or bird, that had come to drink and hardened into a little sculpture with a mouth open in thirst. The ash lockjawed around it. She blinked and stepped back and felt the smallest give beneath her right heel and jerked her foot up, all a child's wild reflex. But it was only a slab with a blackened face and a crack down the middle like an old book opening. She tasted again the iron at the back of her mouth. "Your Grace?" Missandei said, and her voice was like the narrow line of light that finds the seam between two shutters. The glyphs. They stood before a half-wall in which had been set either a frieze or a vanity of other ages, and on it writhed the orderly antique characters of High Valyrian, as if they had been set to flame and kept their positions out of pride. Missandei touched the lowest line with her forefinger and read out the shapes slowly, not translating yet, tasting them first, letting the meaning flower apace behind the sound. Daenerys listened and felt something move in the root of her tongue, an old memory of mother speech. Though she had been hawked hither and yon across the world's markets, though the language of her childhood had been diluted around her by the voices of buyers and wet nurses, still the line of the words came back to her, like the taste of a fruit you knew long ago and did not know you had missed until someone cut it open before you. "Here is written," Missandei said, slower in her everyday words, "that the breath and the fire were bound by will where the earth was softest. The net lies here. When sealed, all things will fall quiet. When spread, all things quicken. All things," Daenerys said, and heard her voice from her good throat and her other throat, the one that lay between her heart and lungs. Missandei read the next portion, her brow furrowing. "There is a price. They speak of offering, of the life that is yours to give and not another's. They caution against a theft." Mirri Maz Duur would have smiled to hear such wisdom, Daenerys said quietly. The day of the tent, the stinking heat, the flies, those memories leapt like fish at a hook and fell back again, water rippling in rings that did not quite meet the shore. She said all spells are words atop words, and the weight of them must be carried by something living. Missandei breathed in, breathed out. They say that the first binding was not so perfect, and that the later binders strengthened and mended and added their own threads. And so it came to be that the breath lay where it did not belong and time moved through it without voice. "They made eggs of the living," Daenerys said. "Perhaps," Missandei said, "or made stone remember." She took the parchment from her belt and compared the copy she had taken in Qarth. Though the Qartheen were arrogant, their scribes had been precise. The match was near enough to be kin. The notation in the margin had been written by an unknown hand that had been careful with ink and uncareful with patience. It had read, "Seal after drought." It had read, "Seal after war." It had read in a small later hand between the lines, as if the later scribe could not bear to keep his speech to the end of the page. "Beware of flood." She had thought then of rivers. Now, with the sound under her feet like the breath of a sleeping furnace, she thought of something else. Daenerys looked up. Through the ribs of a melted dome, she saw sky the color of steel cooled too fast. Drogon had moved while they read. He crouched now with claws dug into the stone, as if the city itself were trying to slide him off, as if he were perched not on matter but on a thought, resistant and false. Regal and Valyrian tacked wide circles, then narrowed, then widened again, uneasy. They had been uneasy since they came within sight of this shore. She had thought at first it was the air. The air was full of old orders. She had told herself before she came that she would not fear. Fear and good counsel often wore each other's belt, but too often fear took the blade and stabbed good counsel through the heart. She had chosen to come. What she wanted could not be had anywhere else. She had felt it in her bones that winter would not be only cold, that the slavers would never stay quiet south of the rainstorms of pain, that her enemies sat at tables and rolled tumbled stones and worked out little sums that had her name at their ends. In her dreams she saw a heat that made all of their sums nonsense, so great that it burned up paper and affection equally and left only the wheel it charred through. That will had seemed to her then like something that could be broken if only one had enough hands. She had 3 hands with wings, but 3 were not enough when the world had 10,000. She had come to make 10,000 out of 3. The chamber with the lattice lay off the street like a room in a ruined mouth. Its entrance had been sealed in an earlier disaster and opened by a later one, and the breakage had made a new doorway through which one had to turn sideways. Ash lay on the floor in drifts. The walls had not toppled here, and within they were painted with the old arts, colors bruised by smoke but still stubborn. There were long stylized bodies on the walls, not one kind of dragon but many, thin-bodied and fat-bodied, winged and wingless, their heads set with long beaks or with rounded muzzles, red tongues lolling in a language of their own, their bodies not lit by flame but by lines, lines that wound around them like threads of light. In the middle of the room stood the remainder of a device. If she had seen it in Karth, she would have. He thought it a fountain, but here where all water came to be steam at last, it could never have been that. It was a low basin with channels cut into its lip, and within it many slots in which might once have been set rods or prisms. They were gone. Only the holes remained, and the lip of the device was rimed with a glassy sheen that looked like melted stone. The channels led to grooves cut cunningly across the floor and into the lower wall, and on the wall between the grooves were carvings that resembled knots and nets. But when she looked longer, she saw it was not a net but a system of roads. Only the roads were never meant for feet. Missandei knelt and traced one groove with her finger, then rubbed the black dust off her skin. "This is where they laid what they owed," she said. "I came to pay what is mine," Daenerys answered. She lifted her hand and looked at the back of it. The skin there was brown with sun and scarred with small everyday harms. No palm line prophesied for her. The gypsy's art had never mattered. The blood mattered. Its salt and its warmth and its specific stubborn color that was hers and no other's. There will be no theft. They had brought what they needed. It was not much, for the city had asked not for money but meaning, and the price of meaning is always the same. The men laid down a roll of tough leather, and from it Missandei took the knife. The blade was dull to the eye, a charcoal gray with a faint sheen like fish skin when seen underwater. It had been folded more times than a gambler's debt. The handle was plain. It felt good in Daenerys's hand, an old friend who did not flatter. She set it on the lip of the basin. The basin was warm. The warmth in it felt patient. She could have asked for another to bleed for her. She could have named a name and it would have been given to her as all other gifts had been given. Wrapped in obedience, with fear for ribbon. She remembered another tent, and the woman's eyes, and the horse thrashing its good blood out. An offering stolen and not given, and the gods making of that a lesson. She did not want another lesson. She wanted a thing to occur. So she rolled her sleeve, she who had been given to so many designs, and now made her own moral geometry. "Your Grace," Missandei said, low, a thread of breath wrapped around syllables. "There is time to turn from this. No shame would follow your steps. There are other ways to make war." "There are other ways to make war," Daenerys agreed, "but not other ways to end it." Missandei's eyes were large and dry. She placed the mirror of her palm under the basin's rim and felt for the place where the old writings said the weight should rest. "When you cut, set your hand here, and," She lifted her chin, her mouth suddenly softer as if she had remembered Daenerys had a body, not only a destiny. And when you have given enough, stop. Drogon made a noise like a large hinge moving in a quiet house. Rhaegal's wings hummed once as if he had slapped air. Viserion landed outside the chamber with a thud. The men drew their shoulders in as if wind had struck them despite the stillness. Ashmotes hung and did not fall, the air too thick with its own thinking. Daenerys took up the knife. She had thought to be brave with it. She had thought to make one long grave cut and hold her tongue between her teeth and let the first crest of pain pass. Instead, she made a shorter, careful incision across the firmest part of her palm, where her hand would close, where the wound would sing each time she grasped. The blade bit startlingly easily, as if she had dipped her hand into another room where pain had waited for her since the morning of her birth. The blood came forward, not in a rush but in a proper flow, and she turned her hand over the basin and the lips of the grooves drank, and the warm stone gave a little sigh. She did not exactly speak the words she had learned. She thought them with an accuracy that bordered on prayer. The room heard. The grooves browned and then reddened as the channels took the blood up like wick takes oil, and a low sound began. Not from outside but from the stones themselves. A murmur like the last conversation in a house before the candles are put out. She kept her hands set in the place Missandei had shown her and felt the drain. It was not only blood. It was years. It was the weight of every look she had ever borne from those who wanted something from her. It was the last breath of her mother, perhaps. Or perhaps she only thought so because her head had gone light and a humming had begun in her teeth. She bit her lip to give herself a point. The taste quickened her. Outside, the sea thumped. A spasm moved through the earth that was not exactly an earthquake but something older, like a remembered injury that had located its ache again. The ash lifted and settled. Drogon roared once, and at the corner of her vision she saw the ripple of his black neck, his teeth like stained pottery, the sudden lake of his eye. She swallowed against her own shuddered breath and kept her hand where it was until Missandei closed her fingers around Daenerys' wrist and moved it gently back. "Enough," Missandei said, the word less an instruction than a relief. She bound the hand tightly. The cloth drank what it needed. The excess made a neat crescent on the thumb side. Daenerys found she had no wish to be heroic. She sat on the warm stone and lowered her head and breathed as a woman breathes when she remembers she is animal too, and that breathing is the first duty and also the last. The grooves glowed now, faintly, like embers that had not quite decided whether to die or live. At the edges of the room, the lines on the walls, the nets, the roads, took on a deeper color, not of paint but of light. They were lighting each other, one to one, like neighbors calling out to neighbors in high spring. A low churning began under everything. It felt obscene to sense so many tons of stone moved and only hear this old cat purr. Missandei's hand settled against her shoulder and stayed there. For a moment Daenerys leaned into it with a frankness that would have surprised those who expected she would lean into nothing. She had always leaned. The difference now was the direction. She gathered herself up and stood and faced the device and the wall and the soft blushing glow of the woven lines. "Say it," she whispered. Missandei understood what she meant and spoke the phrases, not in her slave-schooled bastard Valyrian but in the clean old tongue. The cadence had its own stones to step on. Missandei stepped sure. Her voice filled the chamber without booming. With each sentence the glow deepened until the lines looked wet. Outside, the world exhaled. The basin's face did not change much, but everything behind it did. The seams in the rock that had been fissures became mouths through which something breathed. The sound in the floor rose to a long, steady note. The air grew warmer by one careful degree, and then another, and Missandei stopped speaking because it seemed to her that if she added even one more word, the room would overflow. The dragons spoke instead, all three at once. Not to her, but to something that had suddenly begun to sing to them from beneath their claws. Daenerys stepped forward. She reached and placed her uninjured palm against the wall. It was hot now, but not blistering. Felt like the spine of someone feverish. In somewhere old and unbeautiful in herself, she recognized that heat. It was not alien. It had been waiting all along, as if the place where she should have lain to sleep had always been a culvert. She closed her eyes and the darkness behind them, So often a place where she had seen her own fears do their trick of small theater, filled with other shapes. They did not so much appear as lean forward and permit themselves to be seen. A long eye opened. It had no pupil. It was a blank, reflectant plate, turned and caught her. There are moments when one is not merely looked at but included. It was like that. Her hand on the wall trembled as if a larger hand had set its weight upon it. The floor boomed. She did not fall. It was like hearing her father speak in a voice that was not his. Then the first of the ancient channels opened. She did not see with her bodily eyes the sloughing of cooled rock in dark underground throats. The old locks working as oil found its skins. The last lumps of pickled ash melting from seams that had been sealed in a hurry by men who convinced themselves that a neat burial is the same as a good one. She felt it. Her palm saw it and told her blood of it. A braided thing loosed itself. The air in the chamber pushed against her skin in little soft fists, and then wrapped itself about her throat like a mother's scarf against a winter that had been too long and not long enough. When it came everywhere. The lines on the wall brightened, and a sound like laughter deep underwater pealed out and did not stop. A shudder passed through the ruin that crackled into the sea and drew the smoke flowers apart like curtains at an ugly little theater. Outside, the men shouted. She heard a word that might have been her name and might have been God. Drogon threw his head and his mouth gaped and his tongue. That clever ugly organ unrolled, tasting at the air in a way that made her think of snakes and children learning speech. He screamed then, and it was not the cry he had used in battle when flame jumped her bidding. This was answer. He had been asked a question all his life and now had been given the shape of it, and he shouted yes without speaking the word. Regals struck from the cloud and circled madly, tail lashing. Viserion pale wings flashed as he beat upward, dragon to the third power. The chamber's light sank inward abruptly, as if nothing had happened. Then the world made a sound like a scroll cracking open and went from being a place with its measure taken to being again a place you could not span with fingers. They came out of the ground. Not here, not under her feet. For this building had been designed to hold and shape power, not to be the mouth for it. But along the line of the 14 flames shafts burst. Breath with memory poured up. She had read in a maester's bit of dry ink that dragons are made of heat remembered. That bone is what fire makes to keep its place in the world, and she had laughed at that cleverness. She did not laugh now. Fire found its place with bones. They pushed up as if the earth were forgiving monsters she had buried alive by accident. They came up in size like pebbles thrown into a stream and grown in their fall to boulders. They came up old and new in the same instant, as if time had been a blanket pulled back. Their wings unfurled and were powdered with ash and then were clean. Their mouths opened and found the taste of the air and were greedy for more. The smoke that had been the sea's garment became their garment. They wore it and shook it off. The first one she saw with her eyes was a long-bodied creature like an eel married to a hawk. Its forelimbs jointed into a single long paddle, its hind legs tucked like a swimmer's, its head blunt and broad. It rose out of a crack along the dry bed of an ancient canal, scattered the ash ridges as if a child's small hand had dragged a stick through them. It shook itself like a dog at a river. When it breathed, a thin pale sheet of flame slipped out and lay along the ground and then crawled up a wall. It blinked. Its eyelids were white. It did not see her so much as look through her for the larger thing that had called it. Another rose like a banner unfurling and was immediately met by a third that seized the other's neck and worried at it with love and appetite and all the rough of siblings after a winter inside. A fourth slid up through the mouth of a broken oven as if it had been bred all along. It had no wings, only 4 sets of legs, and its back was till ed in black scales like roofwork. It moved with deliberation that made the hair on her arms rise, as if a deliberate thing could never be stopped by a merely strong thing. Then the sky was full, and somehow still emptier than it would be when they were done, of bodies writing new spells in their motion. Drogon launched. He did not look at her. He sprang as if held back all his life by the measure of her will, and now the measure had been changed. She had expected many things. She had not expected that he would answer first not to her but to the earth. He knew the name of the mother she had never met. It was not a woman's name. He beat up once, twice. The wind off him knocked men to knees and scattered ash like seed. She opened her mouth and made the sound she had used to call him, the word she had taught him. Drogair, a child's sophistication. He did not hear, or he heard and was kinder than she knew and pretended not to hear so that he would not have to disobey her. Regal banked so close she felt the heat of his sails across her face, and Viserion darted recklessly at a long thin dragon that was more wing than body. She felt all three in the meat of her. The old thread tugged and then, to her horror, thinned. She had always thought the tie between them like leather. She had always imagined it could be cut by force. She felt now that the tie was breath, and that something larger than both of them had inhaled. Missandei's fingers dug into her arm. "Your Grace," she said, and for that moment none of the titles meant anything except a way of saying one name. Daenerys pulled herself forward into the doorway, ash whispering at her boots, and she climbed onto the street, into that new air. The men had been brave a long time. No man can be brave for the length of a myth. Two ran. One fell to his knees and hit his head like a child in a storm. One stood with both hands up as if to fend off a falling roof and then simply put them down again because there was no roof he could stem. "Back to the boats," she said, and her voice was steady though something in her felt like bad sugar, syrupy and then hard by turns. "Back, now. We have done what we came to do." They obeyed because a voice that tells you the way down from an impossible height is the only voice that matters. They stumbled under a sky that now had too much in it. She looked up again and saw a dragon too high to be an animal. It was a thought that had remembered its body for a moment, cartwheeled silently against the gray. It was all breath. It was not even flame. She felt dizzy and clung to the broken corner of a wall. The stone was hot. It burned her palm through the binding, and she bore the pain as if she had to put her feet into fire and stand there until her own heat was hot enough to permit her to live. At the shore, the boats knocked against the ship, and the men hauled themselves up like tired fish. The boatmen did not need telling to push off as soon as they could catch a rhythm. Daenerys went up last, Missandei's hand at her elbow, and Drogon, who had disappeared into the paler height, was not above them. A dragon whose back was notched like a saw blade slithered across a broad slab of rock and hissed at their water like a lord at inferior seating. The wave cutter moved, its name like a joke now, and turned its face toward a band of lighter water where the smoke thinned until you could see the horizon line, the color of a knife set upright. "Row," Daenerys said, and stood at the prow again where she had stood before this, and the men made the old work of their bodies into the new work of escape. For a while none of them spoke, because there is an etiquette to wonder the way there is an etiquette to a table. The dragons whirled and did not arrange themselves into any pattern that the eye could catch. She could have called. She did not. She felt as if a hand would come down on her head and press her mouth into the wood if she shaped her lips for it. She had meant to be bold. She had been. Now she had to be something else, something that has no word except to keep standing. Behind them the ruined palaces leaned, and from among them climbed more than animals. They came and came. Some moved with the innocent ugliness of infants, limbs too big, heads like knobs, and found their curve as they went. Some were old or wore old. There was a heaviness at their joints, a way of all their attention being taken with breath and movement. The heat became a wall. The ash rose and fell. The sea boiled in lazy domes that popped and showed green-brown guts before they subsided. They rowed. The oars made their round, unarguable strokes. The men did not look at her now. They did not look away either. Their eyes had lost their little games. She found that there was nothing to say, no order to give that would not be of the sort that is immediately obsolete. Missandei stood beside her and laid the back of her hand against Daenerys's arm so quietly that one could call it an accident. Daenerys allowed the accident, steadied her. When the wind began to move again, it brought a smell like the sweet breath of a bakery and the dry acid scent of a forge. The two together made a third smell she did not know. She learned it now. If she ever smelled it again in the dark years that would come, she would know where it had started. She would recall the taste of iron and warm stone and the last word Missandei had meant to say and had not said, and she would know. A dragon came low, lower, and for a raw instant she thought it was Drogon, the set of the shoulders, the way the mouth held shut like a man holding in his temper. But it was another, a stranger made from a thought she did not yet recognize, and it looked at the ship in the way that a hawk looks at a rabbit while the hawk is still deciding whether it has eaten enough. Then it lifted with a little workmanlike kick of the feet, as if climbing a ladder. It carried up a piece of building in one clawed foot, perhaps by accident. The rock swung and chattered on the claw. It let it fall without looking where it would land. The water took the stone in and made a sound she recognized as an ordinary splash, and that ordinary noise brought a queer, quick flood of tears to her eyes because the ordinary had not left them entirely. It was still there like a nail still holding at least one board to another. The westering light made a barley sugar edge along everything that broke the sky. How long had it been since morning? The heat, earths and skies, made time elastic. It could have been an hour or a day or 1,000 years in which dragons lay remembering their bones. She realized, with a clarity that was almost kindness, that she had done the thing she came to do. She had made the world less hollow. She had also made it less hers. Her right hand ached like a small, stubborn animal. Missandei looked down and saw the blood loosening the bandage and said nothing. That silence was not neglect. It was an offering, the best Missandei had to make. The ship's shadow flattened, lengthened along the gutters of the water. When they were far enough that the city's shape began to withdraw and become again a suggestion, men began to breathe louder, as if their lungs had been in courtesy to something and now that courtesy had ended. One man laughed once through his nose. Another wiped both palms down his breeches in a gesture so human that Daenerys wanted for a moment to put her head down on the rim of the ship and sleep. "Your Grace," Missandei said softly, and the word's shape made Daenerys aware she had imagined Missandei speaking and not actually heard her. "To the east there is a bank that turns away from this smoke. If we take it we may gain a wind." "Take it," Daenerys said, "and tell the men they have done well." Missandei did so, and a small current of pride brightened the labor. Men look for reasons to say they were brave. She would not begrudge them their receipts. They took the wind that came after the bend. It had no memory of ash, and it was almost sweet. In its sweetness it carried another smell, one of fish, of a long summer of fish, and of the sun that had dried nets in long lines in places where no dragon had flown in memory. Fish smell was life smell. She stood within it and knew that beyond the ring of smoke there was still the commonplace world where a woman could love a man who would not love her back and still manage to rise and work the day and feed the child she had not meant to conceive. That world would not remain commonplace. She had set a foot upon it that would not be lifted again. Night came in layers. At first the dark filled the hollows between the waves and was ignored. Then it mounted the shoulders of the men and sat there like an old lover, known again. The dragons did not sleep, or if they slept, they did so like cats, in pieces, eyes loosening, then sharpening, then closing again. She could not see Drogon among them now, but she felt him in the torn thread that joined them, like a plucked string tremor in a piece of wood, still humming although the hand had been lifted away for some time. She could do nothing with the ache of it. She went below and sat at the little table that had been made for the captain, and Missandei cleaned the wound and bound it fresh. The knife lay there between them, the gray of it dull as a weathered cloud. Missandei did not ask where the blade had come from. She knew the answer, from a sponsor in exile who knew that power is sometimes a matter of what sits at your belt and looks ordinary. The two women looked at each other and then away, and the silence between them was like silk laid over a naked back. "You will want to sleep, Your Grace," Missandei said. "I do," Daenerys said. "But the sleep that comes now is not a gift. It is a treasury I cannot trust. I will go on the deck a while." She went. The knight had placed a lantern beside the mast. One of the men, practical, had lit it so they would not walk into each other. From the dark outside the lantern's feral pool there came small noises. A man snoring a little, a man turning over, rope complaining softly about the knot it had to endure. Above, the sky had recognized the day's arrogance and had arranged itself with calm, placing its few stars in a geometry they had always preferred. The smoke ring had by now thinned to a ghost of its day face. Nothing lurched in her except the loss of a thing she had not known she possessed until it had been dulled. Command. Command of beasts, not of men. She knew the latter's hungry eyes and their tricks. Beast eyes had their own greed and their own fidelity, and for a while she had believed that those too, because they were simpler, were easier to handle. This was a child's error in a woman's dress. She dozed on the deck with her back to the mast. When she woke, the sky had turned a pale that is the beginning of color. She had dreamed that she pushed open a great door and found her brother on the other side, wearing a crown that streamed molten down his face. And when she reached to him, her hand passed through him like wind through smoke, and she had been relieved in the dream, not terrified, and then had woken to a more durable fear. They anchored in a little bay that was not properly a bay but a charity in the rock. The men threw fish lines and found luck. Missandei made a thin, savory stew, and they ate it without speech. The dragon's cries had become a new weather, like the soft, constant sound of wind in a city of tall grasses. They seemed farther now and then suddenly close. It was not that they had quieted so much as that the world had put their noise into its new margins. Everything was not a dragon. There were still fish. The second day brought other boats. They were small, the sort fisherfolk use because they cannot help themselves even with new rumors rolling down the coast like a spilled barrel. The men in them saw the wave cutter and Dee lifted hands and then looked past her to the place where the sky wore something that was not a cloud. The bravest came nearer. "By your leave, lady," called a man whose beard was gray down the middle as if a knife had shaved a path. His boat had an eye painted on its prow that had been loved with fresh paint more times than the hull had earned. He did not wear shoes. What occurs there? She considered the verb, occurs, as if the event were a thing with its own will. She was more honest, or perhaps she had found consequence honest in her place. The old dragons breathe again. He made a shape with his fingers that was not any prayer she knew but served him as one. We have had dark eels come into the shallows and die in knots. The children laughed to see them. They will not laugh now that we will starve for lack of eels next month. Do your dragons eat eels, lady? Will they eat my children? It is not my wish that anyone be eaten, but it is the wish of mouths to be filled, he said and smiled without warmth, liking his own plain wisdom. And those are mouths, big ones. Missandei stepped forward, the translation not necessary but the tone of courtesy necessary, and asked, "Have you seen any come to land?" "One," he said, turning his head as if to show them he was not afraid to put his throat on display. "A pale little one, like a candle's smoke. I say little because it was not the size of a house. It sat upon the old stones near the ruin of the fort, where seatime grows, and it coiled its tail. It watched a rabbit until the rabbit remembered how to die, and then it did not eat the rabbit. It looked at me and did not eat me. Then it went up and I fell down because the world had turned to empty under me." "We will leave this coast," Daenerys said. "That is all I can give you now. Will you take the dragons with you? If you can, lady, take them somewhere else to practice feeding. We have very small children. They are like eels in their sleep." "We will take what follows," she said, and it was not the answer of a liar or a politician. It was the answer of a person who no longer wears a ribbon of illusions in her hair. He accepted it, for it was the only true currency that still had weight. When the boats turned away, Missandei stood with her hands folded one upon the other. "The stories will go faster than fish." "They should," Daenerys said. "Fish do not carry sound." By noon, the sky above the smoking sea had learned to write itself in new scripts. Shapes passed and reprised. 2 dragons jousted without sense, their bodies blue-black against the white sky, and one rolled at the last instant and the other snapped at nothing and fell 2 wing lengths as if embarrassed. She looked for her 3 the way a mother looks into a crowd for one particular curl, or the way a taste for a sweet returns and one looks for the vendor with that sweet and no other. Once she saw Regal plainly, his green like a reed bed at dusk, and he tumbled with a second green that was deeper toward blue, whose head had a plate like a shield set upon it. They swam sky and changed places there, and then Regal went as wide as a card trick and was gone. She cupped her mouth and did not call. She had called enough. It was not all up to calling. They turned the wave cutter toward the open east and the southern course that would slip them past the Basilisk Isles. She wanted to pass Karth and show the city that had sold her a mirror its image corrected. She wanted to go to Meereen and look the Freed in the eye and tell them the truth as she understood it. That she had broken one kind of chain and perhaps set a larger one free. She wanted to stand before those who would make a lie out of her misstep and show them a new arithmetic. She wanted to go to Dragonstone and set her feet on that narrow throne and send letters in her own hand to men who had forgotten to fear anything but paper. She had 1,000 wants. She had one wound in her hand. The world is this, you count, not the wants, but the wound and the oars. She slept that night as a child sleeps when someone he trusts sits at the foot of the bed with a knife across their knees, and wakes from dreams of iron gates to find that the knife has not moved. Missandei woke her just before dawn with a hand light on her ankle. The hand said as clearly as speech that she should not be frightened by the waking, that the waking carried no scream. "Come," Missandei said. It was not urgent. They went up together and stood quiet and looked. The sky to the north had grown lower, a lid put upon a pot too small for it. The birds, there were birds yet, flew there and changed their minds and flew elsewise. The smoke that had been steady like a man with a heavy book under his coat became tattered like a man with that book burned out. The sea took color without instruction. On the horizon, a line moved, not long but deep. It was too regular to be a natural line. It was the bodies of creatures moving in a direction. The dragons had found a migration and were attending it. Fish? It did not matter. They would eat other mouths for a while and grow subtle from it. The fishing villages would be poor this winter. The traders would carry sacks and tiers south and north and make a coin of loss. The priests would call their time finally arrived or finally tested. Priests can call any weather proof, she had learned. "Let us speak of the next thing," Daenerys said, and the taste of salt that had been iron became merely salt again. "We have done this. We will not call it back. What we can do is put our hands on the rope and pull where pulling will move something." "Where?" Missandei asked, not with skepticism but with the mapmaker's need for labels on her page. "Meereen," Daenerys said. The word came out calm. "Meereen first, and I will send word to those who would have me for their queen that I will come when I have done what a mother must do when her children break things." Miss Andei's mouth turned as if the word had a taste. "And if your enemies say you are no mother now? They may say it," Daenerys said. "They may write it on banners. It will not teach dragons to read." Midday brought a sail. It showed first as a dark square that lost and found its thin white to the eye. She and Missandei watched its slow gait without comment until the angles of it told not traitor but war. The men put their hands on their knives and told their hands to be brave. The ship came nearer and threw its shadow across them, and a voice hailed them in a tongue they both spoke, though the voice used the version of it with coins sewn into each hem. "Ho, you there, ship of no flag. What trade?" "Food," Missandei called back before Daenerys could say anything else, and Daenerys was suddenly grateful for Missandei's careful lies. "And news, if news still buys bread." "News is dearer now," the voice returned, and its owner appeared, a man in armor that had never been cleaned with pride but always with profit. His crest was a lion, not one of the lions that meant honor but one that meant a man thought himself the sort of animal you should fear because he had paid to be painted with a mane. "What is that behind you? I require you answer to my satisfaction, as I am contracted to say that." "The world made a new sound," Daenerys said clearly. "You have ears for it, if you want them." The man barked like a small dog. "You speak like a priestess. Cannot sell that. Tell me a thing I can put into a ledger." "Dragons," she said. "Living ones, in numbers. To whom will you sell that?" He stared at her as if she had offered him a sack of birds. He did not know yet how to hold it. "The Triarchs," he said at last, "because the way of such men is to name the largest purse they have ever tasted. The bank, the spicers, the men of the islands. There is no one who would not buy this." "Then you will be rich," she said simply. His eyes slipped to the men at her oars and to Missandei and back to her face. Then he looked beyond her shoulder as if a thing he could not stop himself from looking at had moved in that sky. A pale snake in the highest air chose that moment to unroll its thin body and make a knot of itself and slip the knot and go farther. The man swallowed. He would forget to look at her now. She used his forgetting. Tell those to whom you sell that their good cattle are now only the cheapest food. Tell them that their high walls are only ovens. Tell them to stop counting what they own and count instead how many in a given year may be spared when the air turns bright. You speak like a tyrant, he said, finding his footing again because he had found an insult that fit him. You speak like a king who has never paid a cook. I have paid every cook I ever had, Daenerys said. Some with coin, some with grief. Go, shout your news. Be sure that you shout how far these mouths can go. He left in his own time as men paid to do things leave, according to the small script at the back of their skulls. She turned away from him and found herself looking again at the ash, which now was not ash but haze, which now was not haze but future, which now was just air, moving in the ordinary way around the long ordinary shape of a rope. The wave cutter moved as boats do, with small complaints and great patience. They saw islands and kept them to starboard. They saw a whale shape roll and blow and guessed it was not a whale but something else beginning to think of itself as possible. A pod of dolphins went with them for a while and then left without ceremony, as if they had been paid. At night she slept and did not dream of the molten crown anymore. She dreamed of a field of little yellow flowers and of her bare feet walking without needing to watch the ground for glass. The first town they came to that had a mouth wide enough to speak to them in more than gesture was a place where nets hung on poles and children ran screaming and were not reprimanded. The women who bought fish did it as if their coins were not the last coins they would ever own. There is a way people glance up at the sky when they tell themselves they are not afraid of the weather and the sky will likely keep its manners. These people did not glance up at the sky that way. They looked down and kept their eyes on scales and scales alone. This, Daenerys decided, was how one lives inside a new world. First you pretend not to see it, then you learn its price. They bought fresh water there and barley bread and dried figs and a sack of onions. Daenerys ate the bread with such appetite that Missandei smiled to see it. The small trick of the body reminded them both that the future is the same shape as hunger and that if you fill the hunger with bread now you must still fill it with something else later. Purpose where bread leaves off. When the rumor reached them that in Volantis the great bridge had been jammed with horses for a whole day because a red priest had gone out into the middle of it and lifted his arms and cried out that the fire of the world had opened, she listened and did not laugh. The red priests had an arrogance that made her teeth ache, and yet there had been times they had told her true things. They would call this their God's doing. They would stand on roofs and claim what none of them had paid for and set their own small braziers burning and make small men brave and other men tyrannous. She would not go to them for a benediction or a curse. She would let the world sort them for a while and pick up the pieces when they had run out of fuel. Along the way, they found a little ship burned to the waterline, and men black as char clung to its ribs. They pulled two aboard. The men trembled like horses who had outlived their fear. They spoke a dialect of the lower summer tongues. Missandei drew words like water from a well and learned that the men had tied themselves to a mast in prayer and had been spared out of either God's whim or the clumsiness of a young dragon who had not yet married his hunger to his aim. She fed them broth. She set them in blankets. Daenerys sat with them and listened to their poor words and put her eyes on their burned hands and put in the ledger she kept behind her forehead the small debit of their pain. This would not be the last entry. She had expected that. She had not expected how quietly the entries would accrue, like dust. At night she went to the rail and stood and looked at the part of the sky that wrapped the world she had left behind. In that direction haunted a shape like a wound as it healed badly, purple in the day, dark at night, shedding its little ghosts. She spoke then in the old tongue, not to gods, she did not flatter them, but to the world that had allowed itself to be opened. She asked for small indulgences. She asked that her dragons would not be the first to die of this opening, nor the first to be hated past remedy for it. She asked that the first child eaten would not be a child whose mother had always been kind. She could not ask that no child be eaten. She had gone past the point where that could be asked without turning prayer into a self-ridiculing spectacle. She had not lost shame. She had only found the line where shame must seat itself and be quiet. They made land in a cove of low blue rock where a spring came right out of the stone and salted the mouth of its own little stream with itself. Missandei washed her hair there, and Daenerys washed her hand and touched the water to her throat. The men went along the rise to gather fuel for fire and found little but thorn and a dead tree the shape of a letter, fallen long before they came. At sunset the sky lost its red more quickly than seemed polite. In that pause, when day is too tired to continue and night is not yet out of bed, came a sound like cloth being torn across the entire breadth of the world. Daenerys half rose and then laughed once. A risible sound that did not belong to her and yet had leapt up her throat. It was only the dragons. It would often be only the dragons, and often would not be only them at all. And the next work that lay before her was the art of guessing when to be afraid in a new grammar. She was not the only one learning it. On the terrace of a house in Volantis ahead of 3 burning braziers stood a young priestess with hair yellow as saffron and eyes that had bitten the sun. Her robe was thin. She had not been resisting the gaze of men long enough to care about cloth yet. She lifted her hands and saw the tiny tremble at the edge of her left and used that tremble as a pendulum to mark rhythm for the words she had been taught. Words that said the dawn had come out of the sea, and that their God had placed it, and that no one else would ever have the first right to his fire. The men below her raised their arms at any fire that promised them a place to stand apart from other men. The old priest, Benero, across the city, lifted his arms too and made his voice to be a brass trumpet and felt in his bones not piety but triumph. In a shop near the fish market, a jeweler breathed long through his nose over a small repair and told himself that if men wanted to take off their gold and hang it on God for a season, he would wait. He had patience for the season. In Bravos, a man whose face was any face and whose hands were clean with discipline dipped a pen to write a name in a book that had no owner. He did not light a lamp to see better. He did not need light. Light had betrayed men to their vanity. He wrote the name of a woman he had never met because a man had paid him, and because the woman had made a little tower of money out of poor people's bones, and because justice often needed someone to walk its messages to the door. As he wrote, ash fell from the sky like the last stage of snow in spring that makes dying gardens look briefly beautiful. He did not look up. He had never been a man who looked up when the world sought to distract him with its theatricals. Farther west, beyond the water's longest breath, near the Isle of Cedars, a child woke to a sound like the empty belly of the world, and went out and looked and saw the white belly of a dragon in the moonlight and thought it the moon fallen, and reached up to touch it as if one could cup light and put it back where it belonged. The dragon ignored him. The child's mother called his name once, and he returned to the door, and her hands had the smell of the night's work on them. And he thought of a story in which a woman had chosen to draw a chalk circle around her house to keep out evil, and had then had to feed the chalk like a pet. The chalk had eaten everything and then itself. In the citadel at Old Town, a young archmaester wrote and rewrote a sentence in which he meant to declare that the phenomena could be understood by the convection of air and the study of the force of heated gas, and that the old tales of winged reptiles had been born from men naive to the stratified movement of clouds. He wrote, crossed the sentence through neatly, and wrote again, this time with colder certainty, that any such accounts must be submitted to nature as cross-examined evidence. He did not look out the window when a shadow, larger than any clouds, made the room flicker once. He would not look. His profession had taught him that sometimes truth is not the sight but the discipline not to see until seeing can be done without surrender. At sea, the wave cutter slid under a sky with fewer stars than had been due. Daenerys put her hand on the low rail and moved her thumb along it, the way a woman moves her thumb along the lip of a cup while she listens. She felt the ship through her skin. She had learned that one can feel the next day in a boat's wood sometimes, as if wood listens in ways rural stone cannot. The wood told her there would be wind at noon, and that somewhere a storm was being assembled by a committee of embarrassed gods. The boat, too, told her that when the men sang they did not know they sang, that the song ran at the root of their breath, of the oar, of the little grudges left over from the day before. She hummed with it. She did not have to be a queen to do this. The hum belonged to anyone willing to hear it. In the morning, the first of her dragons came back to the ship. It was Valyrian, his pale hide dirted by a week's new filth and new pride. He came not as he had come before, to her shoulder like a raven to a scarecrow, but in a wide circle, cautious as if the boat had become a rock with a mouth. He settled on the mast with one foot and adjusted his grip in little careful hops, then lowered his head and looked at her down the length of his own muzzle. She put up a hand and waited. He stayed where he was for a long time, his breath fogging briefly in the cool of the hour, and then he opened his mouth, not to strike, but the way an infant opens its mouth when it wants to show you its breath. There was a moment in which she believed he remembered, not her authority but her heat. He shook himself then and rose and went again without apology. She did not call him back. She had enough of apologies. She would receive none from the sky. By the time they rounded the low headland that marked the turn southward toward Bay of Guys, News ran ahead with a silly little grin on its face. In a tavern by the quay in Meereen, a man who had once lost his hand in a quarrel about a horse told another man with two hands that he knew a woman who had seen a dragon take a cow up in its feet like a miser with a jewel. In Yunkai, another man took coin on wagers regarding whether they would come as far as his gate. In Astapor, where the red bricks remembered their dye, a mother counted soap uses and said a prayer to a god who had never before attended to soap, and asked that the wings not pass over her house because it had a roof made of reeds and could be taken by accident. Into this world sailed the wave cutter. Its name had begun to earn itself. The men stiffened when they saw the familiar scars of the bay, the long soft green of the shore where men had been killed nobly and ignobly under the very torches of the ships, and no number of men can be killed nobly enough to make a shore forget where it has been asked to listen to screams. Missandei's hands tightened and then released at her sides. Daenerys stood and saw the walls of Meereen and the flag at the top of the Tower of the Harpy, which had been torn down and put back up and taken down again like a poor curtain in a house with many children. She had been these people's queen. She was not now. She had come not to be so again, but something else. A storm lamp, perhaps, or maybe the woman who nails shutters closed in the middle of an uncommon day and tells the house no one is to go out. They docked as any ship docks. The men lay the ropes. The water made its wet, irritated noises and slapped at the hull. The dockmaster came, his expression carefully divided, and the first words he said were not to inquire after taxes but to ask, "Is it true?" "It is true," Daenerys said. He did not ask for proof. The proof had been given to them by their own sky. She went up through the familiar streets with Missandei beside her and two men behind. The people had lined their day with holes through which to look without being seen. They peered out of them now and recognized her and did not know what to do with that recognition. Some turned their eyes away so their faces would not make promises they could not keep. Some watched without shame, like children at races. In the square where she had once sat upon a chair that was a lie and listened to men tell new lies in the same tone, there stood a rough statue of her, an attempt in clay, life-sized, of a woman with hair that looked like smoke and eyes like onyx. The woman held her hands out in an old gesture, as if giving a bowl. The clay had cracked at the wrists. Someone had placed in the bowl space a loaf of bread, now stale, and someone else had taken from it a piece with care. The equity of theft. She paused before it and did not make any face. She did not find fault with the art. The crack at the wrists was true. It was good to see the world admit where something splits. Those who had loved her came. Those who hated her watched the lovers come and solved sums. Those who had no stake came also, because when a thing arrives one wishes to be near it even if one has no coin to place upon it. They asked questions. Is it true? Will the dragons eat us? Are they yours? Can you make them do tricks? Why are you not on a throne? Why do you look like you have been not sleeping? Will there be more food or less food? Will other queens come with their swords? Will the men with boards of coin knock upon our doors when we have no doors left? They asked with their mouths and their eyes and their legs. She answered what she could with the steady geometry of her stance, and with the tone that slips into a market when a woman says to her child, "I know," and the child hears, "I do not know, but I will not give you away." At the house where she had once sat with Barristan Selmy and felt both protected and defrauded by fate, she now sat in a room with a window whose shutters had been repaired twice with different woods and looked at the parcel of correspondences that had awaited any ship with a rumor. Those who had cut quills to write to her had spilled ink not only with praise or with blame but with need. The pages were slippery with it. It was all the same need in different cloth. Make the world behave. She put the letters aside without reading more than the first 2 lines of each. She would answer none of these this night. She would make only one letter, and it would be to no one but the future. "Right?" she said, and Missandei wetted the ink and set the paper straight. The paper had a small crease at the corner, as if it had been folded badly and then unfolded with guilt. Daenerys dictated, "I have done a thing that cannot be undone. I have made it so that what your grandfathers knew in myth you will know in life. I am not sorry. I am not glad. I am colder and more awake. Send word to your kings and your bankers that if they wish to be wise they will learn what it is to stand inside a weather not made for men. Tell them not to build higher walls. Tell them to stop pretending that brick is kin to bone. Tell them to be brave in a new way. I will come when I can stand and look at what I have made and not flinch." She paused. Missandei waited, the quill lifting, then settling, the nib making a tiny scratch in daylight's end. "Sign it," Daenerys said. "With my name only." They sealed it. It would be taken by a swift little boat that made speed its trade. She went to the window and looked out at Meereen. The city was what cities are. A place where small lives made their beautiful failures and their unbeautiful successes. She had loved it once for its possibility and had hated it in the same hour for its resistance to miracle. Now she looked at it and saw that she had been a miracle badly spent, and that those who dwelt within had never asked for a miracle, had only asked for less night. On the second night, a dragon came over Meereen. It was not one of hers. It wore a mane of small spikes like the ruff of a lizard in an old engraving. Passed without stopping. The people in the streets screamed and then were quiet and then screamed again because a second body followed, and then a third. The wine sellers shut their shutters and uncorked bottles for themselves. The men who had spent their days counting clay jars counted the stars and found 2 fewer. The young freedwoman who had placed bread in the clay hands of Daenerys' statue looked up and thought, in quick filthy triumph, that now perhaps those who had been born to better homes would feel fear with a humble mouth. She was not noble. She was just tired. Daenerys lay in her bed and listened. She did not sleep. Fear sat with her, not as an enemy, but as a visitor at a table with whom one shares bread because there is no sense in turning away now. She did not imagine herself to be some kind of martyr. Martyrdom is a pose easier to take when you have only your death to plan. She had plans beyond dying. They were rough plans. They were not the sort one makes in a book. They were the sort one makes with hands on a rope, one over another, backward to a wall. In a village 2 days' ride from Meereen, a boy with a harelip stood in a pen made of fence and watched the goats strike each other in the ribs with their little knobby heads because they did not have good ways to express being alive. In the air above him 2 dragons circled, then drove forward with the single-mindedness of a shadow. He had a stone in his hand. He had an old herdsman's idea and an old herdsman's arm. He threw the stone and it rose to meet gravity halfway. It fell without having done anything anyone would notice. He looked at his empty hand. He had always believed an empty hand gave itself to a purpose more readily. He learned that night that sometimes an empty hand is only empty. A month would pass before the caravans changed their routes. 3 before the singers added new verses to old songs. 6 before the maesters agreed among themselves that a discipline needed a new book. A year before some king would seize upon the dragons as an excuse for a cruelty he would have done anyway and lard it with piety. All of that would come as snow comes and then lingers. For now, there was the room with patched shutters and the woman who had made herself into a blade that insisted upon being a hand again. She went to the stables where horses stood, sideways in their minds as horses always are, and let one lip her palm and breathed the horse breath and reminded herself that there is order in small things no matter how large the sky. She put her cheek against the horse's warm neck. She did not cry. She had found that tears are sometimes a kind of grease that lets you slide past pain without making the shapes of it. She needed the shapes. She would not fasten her enemies to those shapes. She would hold them herself. In the morning, a message stood at her threshold like a boy delivering bread. It was a real boy. He had an eager face and ears that did not trust themselves to lie flat. He held out a tablet of damp clay impressed with a seal that had once been handled by men, who now handled themselves into dignities, as if dignity were a rope one wrapped about the body. She broke it. The message within was not long. The Triarchs send an envoy to speak with the Mother of a Storm. They will arrive in 7 days. They come to discuss terms. They do not come to kneel. She held it in her left hand and let her right hand hang at her side and throb. Missandei read it, and the corner of her mouth made a very small argument with the idea of terms. They will ask for a protection they cannot buy, Missandei said. Let them ask, Daenerys said. I would rather hear the tone of their wanting than guess it and be wrong. They did not have 7 quiet days. On the 3rd, Regal returned, bleeding from the ridge along his jaw. He tore the sky in a pattern that meant he did not entirely trust his own wings. He came low and passed so near that his tail knocked a bench to its side. Children screamed. Men ducked. He did not land. Daenerys went up to the highest roof and stood and held her hand up, and he came nearer and nearer still, until she could see the tiny dry places at the corners of his eyes, the places where even a creature born of fire turns to dust at the edges if it cannot wet itself with tears. He trumpeted then and rose and was lost among his cousins and his rivals. The blood that shook loose from his jaw made a fine scattered pattern along the parapet. She put 2 fingers to one small drop and lifted it to her tongue. Tasted like pennies and like rain, as it hit stone that has warmed all day. She smiled without meaning joy by it, and then went down to see a man who wanted to complain that his boat could not go out for fear of falling cinders. Half the art of being what she had made herself to be was this: to take each small complaint as if it were the only true version of the large calamity, and to make of herself a place where each little stream could empty without making a flood. She did this well until the envoy came, and then she did it better. He was a man of Volantis with teeth white as salt and a beard that a sculptor had planned and then paid to be executed. He bowed precisely once and then made of himself a weight placed upon a chair. His guard stood behind him with the faces men are paid to wear when they stand within killing distance and do not intend to kill anyone that day. The envoy laced his fingers and let his rings click against each other. They made a noise like a tiny horseless carriage. Mother of a Storm, he said. He had been taught to call her this as one is taught to call a prince lord to his face and dog behind his back. Congratulations. It is a new habit of kings to offer me this word, she said. It always seems to mean I am being thanked for making the world uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? He smiled with his eyes, not his mouth. The world is aflame. It is warmer, she said. What will you buy? He did not blink. He had trained his eyelids to discipline. We will buy, if you permit us to, a tract of safety. Safety, she said, and thought of the fisherman's painted eye, of the child's reaching hand, of the way a horse will nudge an open gate and find its way to the wrong field because the gate was open, not because the horse had an evil plan. And what will you sell me in exchange? It is not a matter of purchase, he said. It is a matter of arrangement. Your association with this new force places you in a position. We propose tribute and markers and the mutual agreement to keep order in certain skies. We will fund the building of towers. We will fund the buying of cattle in the north in exchange for cattle in the south so that losses may be balanced. We will. The tide is rising, she said quietly. You wish to count sand faster. He regarded her, then allowed himself a sigh. You force me into poetry. I detest it. Very well. We ask in simple coin this, that the dragons not fly over Volantis, that they not be allowed to roost there, that you, who have opened the cage, shall as the keeper see that they do not make nests on our roofs. She sat back. The chair was an old friend that had seen other backs and had not been polite to all of them. If I asked that the moon not rise, you would perhaps offer me the price of the tide. He said nothing. Silence is a coin when used carefully. He did not spend it too quickly. At last, when she did not speak, he said, You did this. The world believes you did this. The world will hold you to account for it in its new accounting. Whether you like it or not, you are the only voice that could possibly be consulted. And if I say no? He smiled properly this time. showing the even line of salt along his gum. "Then we will pay you less. You would pay me for pretending to control something I cannot control. We would pay you for controlling the people who would otherwise kill you because they prefer to imagine you are in control." Missandei's ink scratched. It was not necessary for her to take notes. She did it because the sound steadied the room. Daenerys folded her cut hand into her other and felt the slow pounding that never quite left. She considered the measure of it. The envoy waited, comfortable in his own self-possession, and it occurred to her with a quiet amusement that men like him would make a market out of the first day of a plague and call it the brave thinking of a necessary caste. She looked at him until the looking was a thing he had to pay attention to. "I will not take coin for lies," she said at last. "If I can make them avoid a place, I will do it. If I cannot, I will not pretend to do it by waving my hand from a balcony and murmuring to the air. You will not pay me for that. It will leave too many chits on my table at the end of the night." He inclined his head. "You are inconvenient." "I have worked at it," she said, and he had grace enough to laugh. They concluded nothing. They made a pattern of words on the air that could be repeated elsewhere by men who needed to show they had not been idle. He left with the face of a man who would invent a different story and tell it better than the truth. She sat and listened to the room after he had gone, the way a woman listens to the hush after children have been put to bed and thinks not of peace but of the next mouth that will cry out. That night she went to the roof again. The stars were thin. The air had taken on the feel of a subtle fabric that wraps itself around you when you are not looking. Anger came then, not at the envoy, not at the slavers, not even at the dragons who had heard another calling's grammar. Anger at herself, and at the arrogance which is love when it is turned inside out. She breathed through it as through labor, and beneath it found something more useful, a plan. She had freed something that could not be unfreed. The only way forward was to learn its language. To do that, she would have to go to its school. There were no desks there, only ledges of old glass and heat and the noise of wings. She would have to go back. She went back, not alone. She never again made the error of believing that solitude made her stronger. She took Missandei and 5 men and an old woman who had once served the healers and had looked at dragon scorch marks on skin and said, "I will see them again before I die and put a cool cloth on them." And this was the sort of prophecy Daenerys had learned to trust. They took water and bread and cloth and the Ray knife and the paper with her letters copy, because stubbornness likes to read itself before sleeping. The smoking sea received her as it receives anyone, with disdain and with its own distracted grandeur. The smoke had shifted. The dragons had learned a rhythm in their feeding and their fighting, and there were less of them in the sky than there had been. Those that were there moved with more economy. They had found their pact with gravity. They had found the hinge that let them turn the world. She walked again through the broken places. The city had changed with these small days, as if there had been an argument among its stones, and the side that favored collapse had won one more point. The chamber of the lattice still held its warmth. It had cooled to something like a hearth at the end of a night. She placed her hand upon it and felt only stone. A wonderful thing to feel after so much God. "Drogon," she said softly then, for the first time in many days, and the sound of his name in her mouth surprised her, as when you speak in a room you thought empty and find you have spoken to another. She did not expect an answer. She got one. It was not speech. It was a fall of shadow that had the shape of a thought finding its owner. She went out onto the street as he came, not swift, not prideful, but with the heavy indifference of an animal that has nothing to prove. He landed and set the dust in 2 ridges, and looked at her, and she looked at him. The old thread hummed again, not as tight as it had been, not as slack as it had been, and she lifted her chin and did not bring her hand forward, because offering hands are a habit that can be shame when they are offered too often. He came nearer and let his muzzle rest against the broken stone, and she knew then that where authority ends there is still kinship. Not love, not obedience, kinship. She reached and placed her palm upon him. He did not flinch away. He let her feel the heat that lay in him like a banked river. He breathed out. It smelled of scorched fish and old stone and something sweet she could not name. She let herself smile then, a small private break of the mouth. That smile did not undo any death in the world. It did not repair the fisherman's losses. It did not teach the slavers their error. It was her own bread. "We will learn," she said to him. "We will learn what they are and how not to be the knife in their hand while they cut the world. We will put our hands where they cannot cut us. We will not ask them to be smaller. We will ask ourselves to be larger." He breathed and moved and lifted and was gone. Missandei stood watching, and only when he had moved beyond the line of the broken dome did she exhale a breath she had been holding without knowing she had held it. "You will stay," Missandei said. Did not ask, and Daenerys nodded. "I will stay," she said. "I will write a grammar." In the days that followed, she followed dragons. She did not pursue them. She did not chase. She watched. She marked where they fed and where they fought and where they slept and where they did not. She learned that they liked a certain white stone when they wanted to lie awake and a certain black stone when they wanted to sleep. She learned that their eyes, when fixed on a thing close, made small movements like measuring instruments, and that their tails told the truth about their temper even when their heads told lies. She learned that some of the new ones were fools and that the fool's folly is sometimes the profit of those wiser. She learned that they did not know yet the souls of men and that they did not care to know. And she thought of teaching them and then laughed at herself and stopped that thought as if it were a horse she had allowed to run toward a cliff. In learning them, she learned herself in the same degree. She found the places in her where heat lay and did not speak. She found the places where obedience once lived and had taken its small furniture and gone. She found the lines in her body that made her movements efficient, and the lies in her mouth that she had told herself in order not to sleep at night. She stopped those lies. She slept. When she woke, she put her foot into the day and did not pretend it was a different floor than the one she had left. Girl children came to watch her at her watching. They squatted on their heels and pretended not to look, and then looked with frankness when she showed them that she did not mind it. It was a game they learned from women. She did not mind being teacher now that the class had no tables. A dragon came and settled so close that the girls could touch its tail if they dared. They did not dare. The old woman who had come with Daenerys came forward and set a basin of water within reach of the dragon's mouth. The dragon looked at it and then did a thing none of them had expected for any animal that is said not to care for men. It flicked its tongue out, not in hunger but in a way a little like a dog tasting wants to show a sort of gratitude. Then it bent its head and let the old woman lay a cool cloth along the back of its jaw where the plates of skin are thinner and heat collects. Daenerys looked at Missandei, and Missandei wrote nothing and smiled. This was not victory. It was not defeat either. It was a small square of cloth against heat. It was a hand upon a muzzle. It was a pattern, maybe, that could be copied in other rooms in other ruined cities where people would come to put basins of water before the mouths of fire and hope to talk instead of burning. It was a way forward that did not so much move as hold. The sky over the smoking sea settled into a weather that men would learn to predict. It would have storms made not of rain but of wings. It would have calm when bodies slept on ledges and dreamed whatever it is that bodies of fire dream. It would carry sometimes a cry that would be just noise and sometimes a cry that would be a sentence. She learned to hear the differ. She did not tell it to the men who needed to pretend there was no difference. She told it to the girls who were ready to admit they could be wrong. When she thought of the envoy, she did not taste salt but dust. The dust of halls where men sit and weigh words. She did not hate him. She thought she might quite like him if the world had given either of them a different table. She thought of the triarchs and of the red priests and of the boy in the pen with his stone. She thought of the maester who would refuse to look out at a new shadow. She did not despise him either. She had learned that contempt is a spice that, once added, dominates the dish. She preferred now to taste the meat. She sent letters, not many, and each of them said the same thing in different cloth. They said, learn. They said, do not build higher walls, build lower fires. They said, when the mouth opens above you, do not lift your baby toward it. They said, do not run, do not stand still, step aside with courtesy. They said, keep water in your houses. They said, watch the sky and train your goats to sleep under something. They said, do not appoint yourselves heroes. They said, when you sell rumor, Be sure you are not selling your children's possible bread. Men ignored her in the old ways and the new. Women read the letters with their eyebrows bending in the middle and folded them and set them under jars to hold down the corners of cloth in the wind. The letters were not edicts. They were the sort of instructions one gives a sister when she marries into a new town. Here, do not hang your washing on the day before market. Here, the men like to spit into the river and pretend it carries the spit down to the sea and therefore into someone else's mouth. Here, the jars will crack in winter if you fill them to the lip. The dragons themselves were not hers and were not anyone's. They were themselves, and that had been the mistake. To think that dominion could be anything but a temporary argument with chance. She had argued hard. She had lost her argument. She had made instead a pedagogy. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, she felt grief. Came without spectacle. It sat without making a noise and then left by the same door. It did not wear a face she recognized. She let it come and go and did not try to catch it by the sleeve and make it explain itself. She learned that sometimes explanation is another name for blame. She had no use for blame now. She had use for water and for cloth and for watching and for the knife when the knife was necessary and for the withholding of the knife when the withholding was brave. Missandei sat with her in the evenings and they said very little. Their companionship had moved beyond what speech can do. Once, Missandei said, "There will be a day when someone will say that you did this on purpose to make yourself a god. Then they will be like the men who think they can throw down a rope to the moon," Daenerys said. "Let them pull. Let them tire themselves out. We will be here when they are finished with water." "And cloth," Missandei said. "And cloth," Daenerys agreed. And for the first time the word made her heart feel less hard. On a day when the air was clear and the sky when it's full blue without shame, she climbed to the place where two ridges made a V and sat with her legs dangling. Drogon came and sat above her, careful as a cat. He did not lay his head in her lap. He kept his dignity. She kept hers. Together they watched a younger dragon try to take off and fail and try again and succeed and look surprised, as all young things look when the body does what the mind has not yet accounted for. She laughed in that way that is not laughter but a short sound of approval you make when you do not want to startle the animal you are watching. Drogon turned his head toward her and she met his gaze. In it she saw not obedience, not love, but recognition. It was not what she had wanted once. It was better. It would leave a hand free for other business. There would be other business. Men would come with spears and with coins and with books and with names. Winter would come with its cold hunger. The dead would ask to be counted again. Children would be born who would never see a sky without a wing under the sun, and they would learn to point with their chins instead of their fingers because their fingers would be too busy holding the small knives their mothers would give them to cut meat into little bits. Stories would be told. Some would be true. Most would be the sort of lies that carry truth past a watchful ear. She would be in some of them. She would be absent from others, and those omissions would sometimes feel like grief and sometimes like a good rest. She did not need to run to meet any of that. She had already walked into the room. There was a table there. She put her hand on it and felt the grain and the old saw marks. She would sit when it was time to sit. She would stand when it was time to stand. She would learn the new etiquette. She would teach it when she could. When she could not, she would hold water and cloth and wait.